Thank you so much, Dr. Paul Lawrence, for joining us in this conversation today. Such a pleasure to have an authority like yours to talk about coaching. Thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you for inviting me, Gaurav.
So, Dr. Paul.
You just call me Paul.
Sure, Paul. Paul, help me understand, how did coaching happen to you?
Well, I've always been interested in people. My first degree was in psychology, and I did a PhD in psychology. And then I went off into business, and I worked in corporate for about 20 years. And basically what I was doing was working in startup businesses and turnaround businesses. And in those businesses, you have to get the people side right. You're relatively small organizations within a big organization, you absolutely rely on people to get it right. And so I found myself doing a lot of what we would now call coaching as part of the role, without really understanding that there was a coaching industry. This is a while ago now. What I found is, towards the end of my career there, I worked in Spain, Portugal, Japan, but what I found towards the end of my career was the people side actually was the bit of the job that I really enjoyed, and the rest of it I enjoyed less. And so I moved into a global OD role for BP, where we were running this massive leadership development program across the globe, and came across some good coaching folks there, and just got interested in it. And eventually, when was it? About 13 or 14 years ago now, moved into this industry as a professional, so-called professional coach, leadership developer, and so on. So that's in a nutshell, that's how it happened for me.
Thank you, Paul. Would love to hear from the kind of work that you are doing, that you have done in the last 13, 14 years. But let's take the first step first. You work with individuals, you work with teams, you work with organizations, you work with leaders and teams. Now, what's your approach to leadership development? How do you look at that?
There's a lot of really good stuff written about leadership development, and there's a lot of stuff which I think is not so good. Leadership development, what is leadership development? In many organizations, and Ralph Stacey writes about this, what's really going on here is that the senior folks in the organization want their people to behave in a certain way. And so we send people off to courses and teach them how to manage people, basically, in order to deliver the message. So it's quite a top-down approach. And I think that kind of gets confused, because we talk about things like authenticity, for example. And we say we want our leaders to be authentic and autonomous. But in many organizations, actually, we don't. What we really want is our leaders to be behaving in a very particular way. We design leadership competency frameworks, which is about, this is how you need to behave as a leader in this organization. We have values frameworks, which says, and these are the values you need to display. So it's actually quite, when you actually sort of unpack it all, the traditional leadership development agenda is really quite it's quite directive, and so you have this thing which I call the leadership paradox, which is, on the one hand, we're saying to leaders, you need to be authentic and autonomous and find yourself, but by the way, we want you to come to this leadership course, and this is the way we want you to behave.
And these are the set of competencies that you need to adhere to. This is how you should be doing things instead.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, that's a very directive way of doing leadership development, which I don't actually think in today's world is terribly effective. Again, I'd encourage people, if you're interested in this stuff, to read Ralph Stacey's work. And he says, you can't program a leader to be a leader by teaching them 10 competencies any more than actually you can program a coach to be a coach by teaching them 10 competencies. What he calls leadership development is, what he suggests is, the essence of leadership development is the development of practical judgment. And I think this idea is becoming more popular now as the complexity in which we're operating just becomes more evident. COVID is a great example of that. And practical judgment says the world is complex. So you walk into any given scenario, then nobody can tell you what the answer is. It's kind of intuitive, but that intuition is going to be more powerful the greater is your practical judgment. So essentially, what is leadership development? I think it's about questioning people, challenging people to define for themselves what it means to be a leader, and giving them the opportunity to go and work in this complex world and kind of learn through doing, and creating the space to reflect on that. And so when we talk about leadership development as 2-day workshops and 3-day workshops, those things, they don't tend to excite people, and there's a reason for that. Whereas, if a leadership development program is, go do this stuff that you're already doing, let's not create additional projects. Go do this stuff that you're already doing, and let's support you with that reflective process. And individual coaching therefore fits beautifully into leadership development, and so does group coaching. Because with group coaching, which is where I think you're really hitting the nail on the head in terms of leadership development, where you get a group of 5 or 6 people together, leaders who are all going through this stuff. You can form these beautiful groups which support each other, as long as the coach is providing that lovely reflective space. And the reflective space is hard these days because people are just so busy.
Yeah. And also, one is people are very busy, and the second one is the kind of competitiveness and the kind of reactive tendencies we all operate from. So when you are working with a group of leaders, how do you ensure that you've been able to build a culture, you've been able to build an environment, is the right word, if I may, where people are willing to open up, where people are willing to share what they are going through with their contemporaries, with people they might be competing with?
Yeah. So there's a lot of language around that. And so people will talk about the need to create psychological safety.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff written about dialogue, which says actually my capacity to engage in dialogue is what defines my capacity to be an effective leader. Dialogue can only happen if you're creating somewhere that's psychologically safe. And so as a group coach or a team coach, and of course as an individual coach, one of the things I'm trying to do, it's my role, is to help create that space in which people feel safe to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
And however, if and this depends on your purpose as a coach, if your purpose is to help an organization and not have because you're not going to go around coaching everybody in the organization, then you need to help the organization itself become aware of the significance of psychological safety, and you need to help leaders develop the capacity to create that psychological safety in their teams and groups, which is hard for people. And you go through most organizations, and through that lens you can see that psychological safety is often absent.
Yeah. And you spoke about dialogue, and you are doing a lot of work in that space, right? Tell me more about what's so unique, what's so specific about dialogue that actually works.
Yeah. So a lot of the early stuff around dialogue was written by Bill Isaacs and David Bohm. And what they did, what Bill Isaacs does is let's be clear what we're talking about here. When you talk about dialogue to a client or anybody else, I notice people's eyes glaze over because, you just got to talk to people, right? You've got to have conversation. Isaacs is quite, he defines quite neatly, differentiates between dialogue and other types of conversation. And other types of conversation include debate, obviously, but also skilled conversation. And there's a big difference between skilled conversation and dialogue. Skilled conversation is what we see a lot of in organizations, where I have a particular view and a particular agenda, and you have a particular view and a particular agenda, and we're very skilled at effectively negotiating. And we have a lovely conversation, and we end up with an outcome that we can both align to, and it was lovely, and we go out for a drink afterwards. That's not dialogue. That's not to say it's not a perfectly appropriate and effective conversation in many contexts. It is. So is debate. But dialogue is where I'm going into a conversation almost agendaless.
Okay.
I'm going into this conversation deeply curious to understand the other people's perspectives in the room. And that is a lot harder to do than described, because if I'm going to go in there agendaless and I'm not going to bring prejudice and I'm not going to bring unconscious bias, then I need to be aware of all that stuff. And of course, I'm not aware of unconscious bias by definition. So to be able to go into a conversation knowing what my agenda is, every aspect of my agenda, is impossible. So pure dialogue is impossible. But it's about going in there with a mindset of, I'm just curious, I just want to know. And when somebody says something I disagree with, I'm parking that and I go, okay, I'm not. But let's just let's follow that. I'd still like to understand that more. So it's about that. It's about a particular form of listening. And it's about saying that thing that needs to be said. It's not just about listening, but I'm saying that thing that needs to be said with respect. And by that, I mean, You may have a different view to me, but I'm expressing my view as my truth. And there's still room in this conversation for your truth. And that's the essence of dialogue. And
Mm,
what dialogue enables, which skilled conversation doesn't, is the emergence of something completely new that wasn't there before. Whereas
absolutely.
skilled conversation, what we'll end up with, happy as we are, is always going to be a bit of your stuff and a bit of my stuff.
Yeah.
Now, I wrote a lot about dialogue, but I think in the context of thinking about change and systems, Bohm says pure dialogue is impossible, so let's forget about it. Because within an organization, that everybody's got an agenda. But I don't think it's that binary, because you can still go into a conversation with the intention of doing your best to engage in dialogue, and that's going to be a
Mm,
more open conversation than if you don't bother.
yeah.
But also, we need to go into those conversations with just attuned into what the power dynamics are and how they're playing out. And
Mm,
so that is all we have to do, right? We just go in with dialogue and be attuned to the power dynamics. That, of course, is very challenging
mm,
and very hard.
yeah. And while I was listening to you, the word that came to my mind was absolutely the same that you spoke about, emergence. In
Hmm.
fact, day before yesterday, I was talking to a friend of mine. He's a business coach based out of US. His name is
Yeah.
John Spence. I'm sure you would have heard of him. Now, I was just talking to him, and John mentioned that when he was the CEO of Rockefeller Foundation, and then now he has
Mhm.
been a practicing coach for several years.
Yeah.
I was just curious to understand from John. I said, John, what has been your key learning?
Yeah.
He said, moving from a space of that I know I'm right to a
Yeah.
space that I know I might be wrong and I have an opinion.
Yeah.
And he said, when I started to move from I know that
Mm.
I'm right to moving in a space that I know
Mm.
that I have an opinion, let me just
Yeah.
listen to the other person, everything started to emerge.
Exactly. Yeah.
And when I was listening to you, the same words were resonating in my mind.
Well, you see, I did some research. What year are we in? 220, about 4 or 5 years ago, where I spoke to 50 leaders around the world, half of whom were CEOs, and we're asking them similar types of questions around, tell me about change that worked. Tell me about change that worked, and what was it that made it work? And what emerged from all of those conversations,
Hmm,
the common theme was dialogue. It's the capacity to listen and the courage to say that thing that needs to be said. A lot of leaders, you know,
hmm,
we know this. We know a lot of leaders struggle with giving feedback. We know we have this whole language around difficult conversations. It's about saying that thing that needs to be said respectfully,
hmm.
and that's just as hard.
For people who are willing to get into this space of engaging with the other person in a dialogue, what do you think? What are the basic traits which are required for those leaders?
Um, what are the traits? I think it's about mindset as much as anything else, and self awareness. So to what extent do I believe in the significance of dialogue? Um, to what extent do I think that's an important thing to even try and do? Question number one.
Hmm,
Um, if I hold a mindset, a principle around leadership, which is that in organizations, people who are here are supposed to know more than the people that know here, that they're supposed to have all the answers, these people have all the questions, it's unlikely I'm going to be going into dialogue, because I'll be taking in with me that narrative that says it's my job to know all the answers. If it's
yeah.
my job to know all the answers, I'm just going to be listening to speak. So there's a whole piece about fundamental piece around mindset. How do I define leadership? And then the second piece, which is required, which is a kind of just a never-ending journey, which is self-awareness.
Hmm,
As I say, to be aware of the inner voices that are telling us that we think we know what the answer. We've got to know those inner voices. We've got to know what our hot buttons are. We've got to know
hmm,
what our prejudices are. We've got to kind of become more and more aware of our biases, such that our pool of unconscious bias just shrinks, but it never goes away.
hmm.
So there's a
Yeah,
belief system in here. And I actually don't, we can teach skills, but it's not primarily about skill. It's about mindset and belief in
yeah,
your own personal approach to leadership.
yeah. Where you're operating from, as you mentioned, the way you define leadership. And the way you define leadership is dependent on the context that you're living from. And that's going to define the behaviors that you're going to demonstrate if you'd be willing and open to get into the dialogue, or you'd still be holding your own biases as you're talking about, and then get into that
Mm.
um, lock on situation.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so Paul, what according to you are the major challenges that you have witnessed in leaders that you've worked with in so many years?
And look, we can talk about challenge, and there's all sorts of different challenges that leaders tend to find hard at different stages of their career. Essentially, again, this comes back to how we're defining leadership. And the essence of leadership, I think, is around our capacity to work effectively with other people. We sometimes, there are some leaders, and we very much respect their intellectual capacity, their capacity to problem solve, and that's wonderful. And for some, we might include that in leadership. But leadership, as I think about it, is my capacity to engage effectively with other people. And that comes back to your philosophy of change. And my own philosophy of change, which comes from a sort of particular thinking around systems, is change emerges from the interaction between people. You can't direct change. You can't mandate change. Change emerges from the interaction between people. So if I'm as a senior leader and I'm looking to change my organization, the first thing I need to do is recognize my organization can only change itself. I can't control it. That's the biggest threat in all of this to leaders, is you don't get to control stuff, but you don't. But what I can do is influence it. And it comes back to what we've just been talking about. If I want to lead my organization in a certain direction, the first thing I need to do is to be open to the idea that maybe the right direction is a slightly different direction than the one I have in mind. The second is I need to be deeply curious about all of the different people in my organization and what they're thinking and what they're feeling. The third thing I have to do is the courage to actually go out and speak my piece, not because I'm trying to persuade you of anything, but because I'm sharing with you what I feel. And if you don't agree with me, that's beautiful. I'm just going to be curious to further understand it. It's what we've just been talking about. And but that capacity is becoming even more important as we try and negotiate all this lovely complexity that's happening. COVID is a beautiful example. You've seen around the world some world leaders try to manage this as something they feel personally accountable for. It's a really complex problem, and I'm the one that's supposed to know the answer, and here's my answer, and you all need to agree with me. We've seen that. It doesn't work. The need for this, the need to lead in the way that we're talking about here, is becoming ever heightened by the way the world's becoming more complex. And it's not just about COVID. It's about Brexit in Europe. It's about, it's about everything.
Precisely. While I was listening to you, another name which is resonating with me is the kind of work that Dr. Otto Scharmer has done in Theory U. And he says that at the bottom of the U, that's where everything starts to happen. And do you trust that the answer would come by getting and engaging in a dialogue?
Yeah.
So
Look, and that's a beautiful question to ask yourself in one-to-one coaching. Because as a supervisor of coaches, I know my own approach to coaching is just a belief in process. I don't need to have an agenda. If I really just do that, I listen, I practice dialogue. I just listen, I try and understand. Whatever's coming up for me in this conversation, I'm voicing it. None of this coaches only ask questions nonsense. So I'm voicing it. And over the years, I just know that an insight and an intention will emerge. I just know it will.
Yeah.
So it's a belief in the process. Whereas I know through supervision, there are some coaches that go, well, if I do all that,
Precisely.
what happens if we haven't got someone? You will. You will.
Yeah. I had a friend of mine. His name is Chris. And Chris often used to mention that in coaching or in supervision, you get into a dialogue with an intention to just be with that person and hold the space for the other person. Help may or may not arrive in that moment. And that was so beautiful when he mentioned the help may or may not arrive. That relieved me with so much of tension that I used to hold on my shoulder, that I'm getting to a coaching conversation or I'm getting into a supervision conversation with the other person, and I have to get the results for the other person.
Well, yeah, I agree with you. And what that brings to mind also is a piece around contracting, because I don't think coaching is always about dialogue. I think there are times when your coachee wants something different from you. And what's okay, what's wrong with giving them what they want? And then again, what some coaches bring to supervision is, how do I know I'm doing a good job? How do I know if they wanted this? How do I know if they wanted that? And the simple answer is ask them. If a coaching conversation doesn't seem to be going very well after half hour, just stop and say, you know what, I'm just not, from where I'm sitting, this just doesn't seem to be going very well. What do you need from me?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm just taking the conversation to a different level, because when I know that I'm engaging with Dr. Paul Lawrence, it will be really unfair at my end not to get into that conversation. you know if you look at the world, and especially the VUCA world that we are experiencing right now, it's at a very
Mm.
different degree altogether, right? Where everything is changing at a click of a button. If you look at the environment, we are going through some really tough times as far as the climatic
Mm.
conditions are concerned. The society is shaping and reshaping and getting into a different form altogether,
Yeah.
where business leaders are coming together. They are asking for a systemic approach.
Yeah.
Well, you are an authority in systemic coaching. So if you can just spend some more time and help us understand, what do you mean by systemic coaching? And how is it different from
Mm.
the normal coaching process that we
Mm.
engage in our day-to-day conversations with businesses?
Yeah. So what one thing here is so I've been doing a lot of work in that sort of systemic area for the last 18 months or so. And the reason I was kind of felt compelled to do that is I kept hearing this thing about systemic coaching. And then people have started copywriting this thing, systemic coaching, and teaching systemic coaching.
Hmm,
And what was very apparent to me is that that phrase systemic coaching is being used to mean all sorts of different things.
hmm,
On the one hand, it's being used to mean one very simple idea, which is the value of just stepping back and looking at the bigger picture.
yeah.
But on the other hand, it's being used to describe some very specific approaches, and many of these approaches are actually quite different in terms of their underlying ideas and philosophies. So my own objective here is not to be the authority on systemic coaching. I have no desire to be, an authority on systemic coaching. My own kind of mantra here or mission is to challenge coaches to, when people are saying being systemic, what does that mean to you?
Hmm,
Because it can mean lots of different things. So become your own personal authority on what systemic coaching is. So someone says to you what systemic coaching, say, well, here's what I believe it is, and be happy to speak from that space, because you've got a lot of choice. Now, my own attempt to make sense of all that was because again, you've got to get beyond let's say the balcony view. That's kind of what systemic means. To take a balcony view, have a big look at this great big thing,
yeah.
rather than just stay focused on the small issue. That's great. But when you take your balcony view, what lens are you looking through? Because there's 101 different lenses you can be looking through, because there's more than 101 different systems theories. And what I attempted to do is to categorize them into 5 different ways of thinking about systems. And
Yeah.
you can call everyone I'm going to talk about, you can call it systems thinking, but as you'll see, they're all quite different. And I don't want to go off into a whole long monologue around theory. So let me
Hmm,
just try and keep this really simple by talking about COVID.
hmm,
Yeah. So a first order approach to systems thinking is where I'm basically thinking of the organization as a machine,
okay.
as a machine.
Hmm,
And my first order linear way of thinking says, here's a machine, and it works. It's pretty simple in the way that it works. It's all quite linear.
yeah.
Yeah.
Linear approach.
That's first order linear. Now, if you
So
think about COVID,
just from my understanding, when you're talking about
yeah,
linear, that there is a cause and then there's an effect. If you put ABC,
exactly right.
you will get
Simple cause and
XYZ.
effect.
Got it.
Yes, exactly. Simple cause and effect.
Yeah.
That's lovely. Now, COVID, the world, I'm not going to name names, but there were world leaders who were saying things early on like, you know what, we've got 10 cases, we're fine. Because even if we did nothing, we'd have like maybe 20 cases in 3 days' time, 40 cases, and we close the border, it's all under control. It's all under control, and all our experts are great experts, all that stuff.
Hmm,
That's an example of first order linear.
hmm,
And it doesn't, that way of thinking, now that way of thinking is sometimes fine, right? If my boss doesn't like me because I shout at them all the time,
hmm.
and I stop shouting at them, my boss is probably happy with me. So that
Yeah.
linear way of thinking can be fine, but sometimes it's not. And COVID is a good example of that. First order nonlinear is saying it's still a machine, but to your point, it's not simple cause and effect. It's exponential. And you've got this thing, I won't go into it, but you've got this circular causality. It's much more complex and it's exponential. Now, if I'm a world leader thinking through that lens, I stand up and I say, I've got 10 cases of COVID. Guys, we might have a big problem here, even though we've closed the border, because 10 cases might be 10,000 cases by next Tuesday. because the relationship with this thing is not linear at all.
It's much more complex and mysterious in nature.
It's not mysterious.
Hmm.
Mysterious comes next.
Okay.
It's not mysterious. It's just very complicated, and we're going to have
Very
to
complicated. Okay.
an aircraft engine. We're really going to have to. We're really going to have to think hard about how this thing works because it's not immediately obvious.
Hmm.
So mysterious is fine, but I just use mysterious for second order. That's all.
Okay. Okay.
That's first order non-linear, and again we see that, and I think we still see a lot of that thinking in some of the world leaders now today.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think some shifted from linear to non-linear, but hey, there's places to go here. Second order says, yes, it's a machine, but to your point, how this thing works is mysterious, and we're never going to be able to work it out.
Hmm.
Partly because we don't have the capacity to look at things objectively.
Hmm.
We just don't. We look at stuff, we interpret, that becomes our truth, but it's just one truth. So
Yeah.
how can one person possibly diagnose something that's as mysterious as COVID? Too
Hmm.
hard. So what do we need to do here is we need to get lots of different perspectives into the room,
Hmm.
because the more perspectives you've got in the room, the closer we're likely to become in our interpretation to the fundamental essence of how this machine operates. Now, that's second order thinking.
Okay.
And now, lovely. I've doing some work for a professional services organization here very early on who said,
Hmm.
when COVID sort of arrived fairly late in Australia, and she said, let's go, we need to go straight to the China office and find out what's been going on and what their view is on this. We need to go straight to Singapore because they had the whole SARS virus thing, right?
Hmm.
Canada had SARS virus. So we need to get out there and get all these different perspectives on what does it look like. Now that's more of a second order way of thinking.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It is. It is absolutely. I can see that how the first order
Yeah.
is different from the second order.
Now, the fourth is when we start getting into theories around complex adaptive systems.
Okay.
Now, the complex adaptive, I'm going to try and kind of summarize complex adaptive systems in about 30 seconds. What it's basically saying is that change emerges from local interactions,
Hmm.
right? So,
Change emerges from the local interactions.
from local interactions. So I'll give you an example.
Hmm.
COVID again. You read the newspaper and it says, wow, we got the virus and it's going to spread. Now, I sit in the pub with my mates and I say, yeah, it's just like the flu, right? It's just a
Hmm.
bad case of the flu. We'll be fine. We're just going to keep drinking, social distancing. We'll forget about it. I've got a group of people who are just coming out of the local hospital, all of whom have got elderly relatives, who are saying, wow, we've got to pay attention to this. Let's go straight to the shop and put our masks on. And so on and so on. So you've got people will make sense of any change socially with others. And you'll get these little groups forming who are all coming up with different interpretations of what's going on. And their reaction and their response will be different. And then you have all these different responses mixing with each other. And that's what you're seeing at the high level. Now, if we don't think through the complexity lens, what we just see is chaos. And we go, well, what the hell has just happened here? That's just chaotic, completely impossible to understand. It's chaos. We can't do anything. But if you're looking at it from a complexity perspective, you go, okay, we need to understand this. We need to go local and we need to understand what's happening locally. Now you think about COVID, I don't know, here and in the UK, other places too, big uproar when the sun came out. Lots of people went to the beach and they just packed in, right? They did this on Bondi Beach in Australia. They did it in Bournemouth in the UK. And the government just went, what are these people on? Do they not understand? What are we going to do? We just got to get the big stick out and just make them understand. Okay, that's one way of thinking about it. But that way of thinking about it implies that we have control. The complexity lens opens up the whole idea. You don't get to control anything. And positional power is important, but it's overrated. So if you're thinking through that lens, when instead of getting, or maybe as well as getting very cross, I'm getting the taxi to Bondi Beach because I want to go and talk to all these people on the beach and find out why they're there. Find out what's going on here. What is the meaning being made of this that makes it okay to be on the beach?
Absolutely.
And on that beach, by the way, you'll have lots of different people who are there for different reasons. So that's complex. Now, that's a very different way of looking at the world.
No, it's making sense, because this is exactly what happens when mergers and acquisitions happen, right?
Yeah,
The message that
absolutely.
actually the messages that actually reach out to the bottom half of the organization is very different from the statement or the declaration that was made at the top end.
Yeah,
And when I
yeah.
make a different interpretation of the message coming my way, I'm going to respond to my worldview rather than looking at the world from your worldview.
And we do, because we're human beings, and that's where we start getting into questioning the value of comparing the organization to a system. Because when we talk about aircraft engines, and we're talking about machines with components, human beings are not passive components. Human beings make their own sense of things. And then we get this thing called resistance to change. And because the leaders say, look, I've done all the analysis, I've got all the logic, this is what you need to do. And they don't do it.
Yeah,
They're
doesn't work
resistant
that
to
ways.
change. They're not resistant to change. They've just made a whole different meaning of what's going on here. And if you want to be an effective leader, instead of getting all cross and frustrated, or maybe as well as getting cross and frustrated, go and talk to with curiosity to understand how change is happening in your organization.
Yeah, yeah.
And I loved your example around M&As, because that's what happens in mergers and acquisitions all the time. Top says this is what's going to happen, and it doesn't happen. Why is everyone being so resistant?
Yeah,
Go and
yeah,
talk to people and
yeah.
find out what's really going on.
So, Paul, I understand you've already answered that. In fact, you've already given the solution that go into a dialogue with curiosity.
Almost the same thing. You can't engage in dialogue without being curious.
Yeah. So, what is the solution? I mean, it's very easy said than done. How do you actually practice that into your day-to-day conversations within an organization? How do you practice that?
Dialogue. Um, well, here again, I think we come back to the system stuff that we've just been talking about.
Mm,
System, but the other way of thinking about systems is meta-systemic, which says there is no such thing as a system. There is no such thing as an organization, and there's no such thing as a team. Yeah, an organization is just a construct that we invent for ourselves. Sometimes it's a useful construct, and sometimes it's not. An organization exists in the sense I have a contract with somebody, but in any other sense, how is it real? And it can be a very limiting construct,
mm,
because a lot of people spend a lot of their time talking to people who are not part of their organization. They talk to people who are outside the organization, and meaning is made just as much in those conversations as the ones that happen inside the organization. So this notion of organization can limit us. The comparing organizations to systems can limit us, and we call that the meta-systemic perspective, because it's not the anti-systemic perspective, it's the meta-systemic, which says these metaphors like organization, system are sometimes useful, great, but just recognize they're not real. Now, if I'm looking at the world through that lens, to come back to your question, then I know that, and I believe that change emerges from conversation. It doesn't just emerge from dialogue, change emerges from conversation. Then I start thinking about, okay, who needs to be engaged in what conversation? Do I need to be engaged in? This is where the systemic piece comes in. Because as a leader, I do not have time to go around engaging in dialogue with everybody. It's not realistic. And as I said before, there's nothing wrong with skilled conversation and debate. It's a question of being purposeful about what type of conversation I need to have with who, when. But if I'm looking for that emergent change, then I'm going to be looking not only at who do I need to engage in dialogue with, but who else needs to be engaging in dialogue. So it's a dialogue piece, but it's got that whole, and I hesitate to use the word systemic now because it's more about that kind of social network thinking analysis.
Precisely, because there's a lot of social network which is involved, and things are going to be very, very adaptive in the moment. Otherwise, we'll not be able to see the sunshine.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Paul, you've also done a lot of work in the space of helping organizations build the coaching culture. Now, personally, I've witnessed most of so-called initiatives to build the coaching culture in few of the best organizations in the world. I don't see them very successful. Or
no, they're not.
So what do you think? What is the biggest hindrance in building the coaching culture in an organization?
Look, there's lots of ways of answering that question, but I'm just going to answer it through the same lens, which is different ways of thinking about systems. Because the most common way of thinking about systems in organizations is that first order way of thinking, which, as we know, works sometimes, but it doesn't work when you're trying to change a culture. When we talk about changing a culture, what we're trying to do is actually change the way that our social networks operate. don't get to do that. I mean, you don't get to tell people to do things differently. Well, you get to tell them, but they don't always agree with you. Now, if you look in a lot of even academic articles as well as books, they'll say things like coaching culture is coach the leaders so they understand what coaching is, and then train middle management. You'll be right. And you can overlay that with Cotter model type stuff, which is saying, make the case for change and kind of push people into communicate it, which means tell them what to do. And then, and then almost magically at the end, there's embed the change. Can you see how linear that is? The way that, so it's easy to talk about what we shouldn't do, but what my own attempts, as a consultant to help organizations change, and some of those have been successful, is to say, okay, why are you doing this? What's your purpose? And I'm not asking the organization, because there is no such thing as an organization. I'm asking lots of different people in the organization, say you want to change your coaching culture. What do you mean by that? What's the purpose of this? And you will almost always find that if you talk to 10 people, you get 10 different answers. And so it's quite a useful thing to do to get those, depends on who they are, but to start getting people together to have that conversation together in dialogue, from which will emerge a more kind of set aligned purpose. You need purpose. A lot of senior execs in organizations say to their HR department, go and do a coaching culture. That's your job. Of course that doesn't work. The way, the other thing is we need to, and it's what you said before about people don't do as they're told. They make their own sense of stuff. So when we're running coaching skills programs, we run them over at least 10 months. And we start by not telling them what coaching is. We start by asking them what coaching is. We get them to define coaching, what's going to be a useful definition. We will share some thoughts around coaching, but ultimately we say, so what's in your organization? How do you want to define it for your organization? And if you've got 10 cohorts of people going through it, you'll ask every cohort, and then ultimately you'll get the cohorts to come together and define for themselves what is coaching, recognizing that definition will change over time. So what is coaching? We then share with them some stuff around listening and some dialogue, basically, some stuff around listening, some stuff around voicing. Yes, we'll do some stuff around grow and clear or whatever, but that's the last thing you need to worry about. It's not about, coaching is not, coaching culture is not one where everybody just goes GRAW. It's about your capacity to listen and speak. So if you're going to, if we want to help people to engage in dialogue, as I said before, we need to start recognizing this is not just about a skill. This is about mindsets, and to help somebody shift their mindset, not in accordance with what you want, but in accordance with what their colleagues want. You have to create that ongoing opportunity. It comes back to Ralph Stacey's practical judgment piece, for people to practice this stuff over time, come together with their colleagues, go, oh, that didn't go very well. What sense do you make of that? And it takes at least 10 months. You run these things over 10 months, and it happens time and time again. People after 6 months will go, well, this coaching stuff, it's not just having a conversation in a room every quarter, is it? No. And you go, I said that at the beginning, but it takes people time to work. This coaching stuff, this is stuff that you actually do day to day, isn't it? And this starts to emerge around 6 or 7 months. But if you just put someone on a workshop, right,
and they love it, workshop,
whatever, and they love it, but then they're stepping back into the system. And if the system does not support that new behavior,
absolutely.
If you want to change a coaching culture, you are doing culture change. So what is your change philosophy? Have you got one? If you're trying to do coaching culture without a change philosophy, then you're in the wrong place, because you're just doing a checklist thing. I've seen this. I've seen L&D departments say, we do the 2-day workshops and the rest is up to them. Well, you just wasted the money on a 2-day workshop, because that's not going to get you anywhere.
Because that's very transactional, right? It's not going to change the soil in which we are going to sow the seed. If coaching is like a seed, right? So we need to work on the soil as well, as much as it's dependent on the quality of the seed that we have. So in order to work on the soil, and what we are saying that is, in order to ensure that the environment in which we are going to imbibe coaching, that is ready. What do you think? What is the basic homework an organization needs to do before they invite this initiative in the organization?
Well, first of all, I think you need to be very wary about this idea. If you, as the consultant, internal or external, you need to just watch yourself. If you've already decided what this coaching culture needs to look like, it comes back to what I said before. The planting the seed piece is about getting the organization itself to have a conversation about what do we even mean by coaching, let alone coaching culture. Many organizations, when you start coaching culture, what we do is we go and talk to the organization first and say, what's coaching? And it often comes out, coaching is teaching, coaching is training. So what is coaching? Let's define that before we go any further. What do you mean by a coaching culture? What does it you mean? Not what I mean. What do you mean? And
Yeah.
why are you doing this? Why is this important? Because if this isn't intrinsically important in helping you as an organization do what it is you're trying to achieve, it'll just end up on the list of 101 other projects.
Yeah. Another project, tick in the box.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So what I'm listening right now is, Paul, two things. What do you mean by coaching culture? And why is it important to you? What is the intrinsic driver that the organization has? And in this case, as we are talking about, that organization is just it's just a concept. So that means the people who are driving that initiative, why are you even driving this initiative? So that's the first step, right? Is my understanding right?
Yeah, exactly.
What else?
That's where you start. It's not a linear process. It's about you're having conversations all over the room to say, what is it? And by the way, that phrase coaching culture can just get in the way, because what are we actually trying to do here? We're basically, what you tend to be doing is you're trying to change the way people relate to each other. That's what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
You're just trying to get people to listen more, depending on how you define coaching, but to listen more and to voice with courage, to be more self-aware, to think a bit more. That's what you're trying to do. Probably you might define coaching a bit differently. So what is it we're trying to do? And then, yes, you can do some skills introduction. And then what we do as we go along, we're constantly talking to the organization and getting the organization to talk to each other about, and what's changing here, what's working, what's not working. All right, let's identify what's not working and let's have some more conversations around it. You're basically framing an organization-wide conversation for about 10 months, and then you get to a different place. But just recognize that where you got to is not the end of a journey. It's just where we are today. And where you're going to be in a month's time will be depending on all the conversations you've had in that month. It's, you can change your CEO and the exec team, and overnight your culture changes. Of course it does. You can spend 5 years and get to this thing that you call a coaching culture, and it changes overnight because you just gone into a merger or got a new leadership team. There is no end point. It's a dialogue. It's just an ongoing dialogue. And I say just as if that's easy, but that's what you're trying to do. You're just trying to help the organization engage in that ongoing dialogue and recognize that it's the nature of the dialogue moving forward that will determine where you go, which is lovely when organizations say, yeah, that's true. So we need to actually be thinking about who's engaged in the dialogue. So let's change our recruitment processes and actually be a little bit more discerning about who we bring in. And so on and so forth.
Yeah. So, while I'm listening to you, Paul, a very practical question which is coming to me, and at least I have experienced that while I'm working with several organizations today in the country to build a coaching culture. One of the biggest challenge that I face is getting a lot of resistance from different levels in the organization. So, the top management team, they have their own ways of looking at business. So there's a deeper need to control things. At the middle level, people have their own resistance of the way they deal with their downline. At the same time, the way they deal with their upline. And people at the bottom of the pyramid, they have a deeper need, or they would prefer to get answers from their top bosses.
Yes, absolutely.
So there are different resistances that I personally come across on day-to-day basis. So how do you deal with that resistance? And that's the second last question. After that, I've got only one question from you. So please go ahead.
It comes back to what is resistance to change. Resistance to change is unanswered questions. That's what resistance to change is. When the leader says we shall be, our brand is now going to be green instead of blue, and everybody goes, well, we liked blue. We go, well, it's going to be green, but we like blue. It's going to be green. And if anyone continues going on, you're going to lose your job. The we want blue is a question. It's a question, and the question is we don't understand why it's so important to move to green. I'm in work in the contact center and everybody loves blue. I don't understand. Help me understand. It's a question. Now, similarly, as you talk about resistance at different levels I love what you just said, because coaching doesn't necessarily mean the same thing at different levels of an organization. what you said is absolutely resonates in my experience. If at the sort of supervisor level, what I want when I say I want to be coached, if I'm on the shop floor, it often means I want you to share with me your wisdom and tell me what I should do.
Yeah.
Now, are you okay with that? Are you okay that at that level of the organization, that's what coaching means? And it's going to mean something slightly different. And middle management coaching tends to mean I need to help people who already lead people become better leaders of their people. How do I do that? Do I need to coach upwards because my leaders are just, they don't share with me what's going on here. So coaching can mean different things at different levels of the
Yeah.
organization.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But do we call that resistance? I don't know. To me, it's just an unresolved conversation. And his resistance is to go to the person who's resistant and say, what's the question here? What's the unresolved question?
Yeah. Hey, that's a great takeaway for me. What's the unresolved question here?
And am I open to the question? This is what I mean by listening. Because if I'm listening to that question going, yeah, same old, same old, same old, same old, can you shut up and I'll tell you what the answer is again, then I'm not listening. I'm not listening for what that person can really say. I'm just listening to the words so that I can repeat myself for the 50th time. And by the way, there are textbooks out there and articles that say, if you want to be good at change, just if you don't be worried about repeating the same message, because if you've done it 52 times, you're on the right track. That's often how long it takes. Bullshit. That's how often it takes for people to go, I'm just fed up of asking.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much, Paul. I think that's a great conversation I had with you. So we spoke about what is coach. I mean, your introduction to coaching. Then we spoke about the dialogue. Then we spoke about systemic coaching. I think that was a great piece. And of course, I mean, the kind of wisdom that you shared in terms of building the coaching culture in an organization. And the personal, my key takeaway is what is the unresolved question that I'm not getting onto? So, Paul, if you were to give a piece of advice to people who are just getting introduced or they would want to get introduced to systemic coaching, what would that be?
My advice would be actually invest some time in finding out, what systemic means. As I said before, my advice would be to say, and it's, I don't give advice really, but my suggestion would be find out for yourself, call yourself a systemic coach. You're systemic. Systemic is just about taking a balcony view. What kind of systemic are you?
Yeah.
Go work that out for yourself. And the only way you're going to work that out is by reading some stuff, talking to some people, being curious and reflecting on that, maybe with a supervisor, to come up with your own version. So work it out for yourself would be my advice.
Yeah. And also, not to forget what you just mentioned, what is systemic coaching to you and why would you want to get into that? As these are the two questions that you offered to any organization or the set of people who are driving this organization to get into to build the coaching culture. Why would you want to get into, why would you want to build the coaching culture and why is it important to you? Similarly, why would you want to get into systemic coaching and why is that important to you? Paul, thank you so much. I think it was absolutely a pleasure to interact with you. Great conversation, great insights. And as I mentioned, I'm leaving this conversation with this one question. What is the unresolved question that I'm yet to get onto? So thank you so
Cool.
much.
Beautiful. Thanks, Gaurav. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.